Speaking of prostitution, of course, there were, as I said, some public scandals involving male prostitution, but of course female prostitution was much more widespread, and this was such a big problem in Victorian cities that they started to use a kind of byword, the great social evil. In Victorian world, the great social evil means prostitution. And some historians, well, all historians agree that the Victorian period and Victorian cities definitely, around the middle of the 19th century, this was the time of the greatest prevalence of prostitution. So the numbers of women doing sex work, either full-time or as a kind of part employment, were the highest in history. Never before and never again were there so many women working as prostitutes as in Victorian England. How does this tie with the Victorian ideal of the monogamous, faithful, middle-class, heterosexual marriage with children? If there were so many women doing sex work, there must have been even more clients. So this has of course been observed and commented upon by many scholars, and the Victorians themselves didn't really know how to answer this question, what the reason was. Of course, the reason, as we now know or as we now think, was the impossibly high standards of behavior. The expectation of young people, and especially young women who got married, to be virgins. Whereas at the same time it was expected of young men who married to first of all know what to do with a woman, so they had to have some sort of experience, at least theoretical, and also to have a stable income that would allow them to set up a household. So they were not teenagers, they were usually in their later 20s. So this leaves a relatively long time between puberty and accumulating enough capital to be able to marry and set up a household. So rather than have some sort of equal relationships with women from their own sphere, so for example start engaging into sexual activity with their fiancés or girlfriends or some other women from their social sphere, treated as equal partners. Many Victorian young men had their first sexual experience with servants. This was quite notorious. This could take the form of seduction, either of a young servant by the master's son, or sometimes the master's son by a scheming, slightly older and more experienced servant who wanted to pressure him for some gifts or money or something. This could also mean rape. So it was a very real and common threat for young women who started their work as domestic servants to be raped by their employers or employers' sons. The other possibility of getting some sort of sexual experience before marriage for the boys from the respectable social background was of course to visit a brothel and to have the sexual experience with a prostitute. This is a kind of frequent theme in Victorian art and in neo-Victorian art. It's like all over the place, and it's like absolutely, there will be a brothel, there will be some prostitutes in any kind of neo-Victorian story. You may get situations of the father introducing his son or sons to the reality of life by sponsoring a visit to a local brothel, so that the boys would be instructed in the ways of the world. This this really happened. Perhaps not as often as literature, especially contemporary neo-Victorian literature would have it, but it did happen, and definitely there were lots of options. There were special guidebooks published detailing the establishments and their employees, or the specialties of particular women working in the brothels. You could find such publications. Actually, if we also include the subject of pornography, this was rampant, and anyone who had the money, the middle class, the upper class, they would have access to pornographic materials in the written form, so literature, stories, and so on. Also in the new technologies. The moment a new technology appeared, it was used for porn. As ever, really. So photography, film, you have it. Within a few days it will be used for porn. Which really tells you something about the popularity of pornographic materials and the market and the demand for pornographic materials. So there were lots of problems with prostitution. The biggest of them was not really the threat to morality, although some said it was, but the spread of sexually transmitted diseases, especially syphilis. Syphilis is the great scare, is this killer disease and this kind of monster disease of the Victorian period, the same way that AIDS was in the 1990s. This was a disease that was demonized as a kind of divine retribution for sinners. This was a disease that was especially scary because it was badly treatable. It was a kind of race against time, whether you killed the disease or the disease killed you, or the cure for the disease killed you. It could be easily transmitted to innocent parties. So there are many stories of respectable women being infected with syphilis by their unfaithful and womanizing husbands. This was the story of Karen Blixen. This was the story of Isabella Beeton. From what we know, some of them knew about it, some of them we just can now analyze the symptoms described in their diaries or autobiographies or something, and we can deduce that they were infected with syphilis, most likely by their husbands who visited brothels and had sexual contacts with some infected women. You didn't have to be a total profligate. It was just one unfortunate encounter with an infected person that could basically scar you for life. And there were all kinds of horrifying aspects to the disease. It could draw you mad. This was something that the Victorians were really scared of. This was the disease that caused insanity. This was the disease that caused facial deformation. And generally the scarring, it was visible. It was actually visible on the outside. And perhaps the worst of all, it could be passed to children in the womb of the mother. So if the husband went to a brothel and caught syphilis, and then infected his faithful and loving and ideal wife, and she happened to get pregnant, she might in turn infect the unborn baby, who would be born deformed or ill, or basically, well, if they were lucky, they would die soon. If they were not lucky, they would suffer for a long time and be also a kind of source of guilt and shame for the parents. So this was a huge problem, but as you can see, that the numbers of brothels and sex workers were enormous. Why would it be so? One of the reasons was the army. The cities that had particularly large numbers of brothels and prostitutes were the garrison cities, because it was very difficult for regular soldiers to obtain an official permission to marry. There were two ways for a soldier to marry. He could marry so-called on the roll, so with official permission, and if he could obtain this permission, this provided some protection for his wife and children later on. So for example, when the garrison relocated, the families of the soldiers who were officially married with permission would be relocated together with the garrison. Usually the wives would be employed by the garrison to do the cooking, the cleaning, they would wash the clothes and the linen, and basically they would do some sort of helpful work. Of course, how many helpful women servants you need in an army garrison? Something like perhaps 10% of the soldiers were given the permission to marry. The rest, there was no law against it, so if they found somebody who they wanted to marry, they were still not prohibited from doing that, but there was no official help for the soldiers' families then. So for example, no relocation, no jobs. They were like, this was their private choice, and this was outside of the garrison. So many soldiers in the 19th century tried not to marry for as long as they were in the army. They tried to wait until they retired from the army and then marry, or just to have mistresses, and if they could not find a stable mistress, they might become the clients of the local brothels. And there were lots of brothels in these garrison towns, and of course the venereal diseases were rampant. So again, a legislation happened, so the legal discourse gets in, and the parliament passed a series of acts called the Contagious Diseases Acts. We are talking about the 1860s. It was a series of acts which was intended to prevent the spread of venereal diseases, mostly syphilis, which was the most dangerous, in garrison towns. So according to the new law, there was no law against prostitution or even keeping brothels, but they have to be regulated. So, for example, the prostitutes had to undergo medical checkups regularly, and in case of finding an infection, they would be treated. But according to the new law, there was one especially problematic clause which said that any woman suspected to be a prostitute could be taken to the nearest medical station and examined even against her will. Suspected to be a prostitute, which in practice it meant any fairly young or youngish, poor-looking woman walking alone in the street, especially after dark. Somebody might just believe she could be a prostitute and basically kidnap her and force her to undergo a rather invasive and unpleasant medical examination that by some journalists was even compared to rape. If she was not infected, she would be let free, sometimes only the next day. But I hope you can see the problem. First of all, only women were punished. There was nothing said about the clients. It was the women who were believed to be the source of the disease, the way that the disease spread, and they needed to be controlled, they needed to be treated, they needed to be kind of frightened into obedience. So this Act of Parliament was extremely divisive and controversial, and it resulted in the mass demonstrations and mass protests against those Contagious Diseases Acts. And part of the campaign was led by one of the great Victorian women, one of the great social activists called Josephine Butler, who was a respectable middle-class woman who just wanted to find a worthy cause for her to get involved in. And she organized campaigns, she organized marches, letter writing campaigns to the parliament, and 20 years later, a mere 20 years later, the Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed, so they were banned or kind of abandoned. Later on in the late 19th century, of course, prostitution remained a problem, and there were different ways, just as Foucault said. So there is this medical discourse, there is the legal discourse, there is a moral discourse, there is this whole concept of a fallen woman, who is a very loaded term in Victorian world, and the fallen woman is a rather broad term, mostly used to denote prostitutes, but any woman who strayed from the norm could be condemned as a fallen woman. If they were really sex workers and they wanted to change their life, there were very few opportunities for them. There were some reformatory houses organized. Some of them were better than others. There were, of course, mostly in Ireland, which was part of the United Kingdom then. There were those Magdalene houses, so mostly run by the church, Catholic and Protestant churches. The prisons for women, or kind of workhouses for women, especially established for the fallen women to repair their morality. They were mostly treated as slaves, working, doing some sort of physical labor, very often laundry. These were like big laundry factories. There was a lot of symbolism involved, that these women would kind of wash dirty linen and then they would wash their souls, whatever. There were some smaller reformatory houses for fallen women, sometimes also run by respectable middle-class women activists, and some of them were quite successful. They tried to instruct these poor, usually working class women, very often very young, in some employable skills. So they might work as seamstresses, they might work as domestic servants. There would be a whole network of kind of sympathizing families who would employ those reformed fallen women. But this was a huge problem. I remember reading in one source, I don't really remember which one, was it Henry Mayhew perhaps, and his accounts on the life in London in the middle of the 19th century, that according to his calculations, there was one prostitute per 12 men, including infants and old men and ill men and anyone else. So this was really a huge thing, a huge problem. Later, at the end of the 19th century, some activists tried to focus on the client group, so to educate young men, to educate teenage boys to respect women more, not to seek the services of sex workers, and basically refrain from becoming clients of brothels. Perhaps this was a better way to do it, but really the situation changed with the changing of social norms and more liberal, relaxed sexual contacts after the Second World War in the 1920s. This was the real reason why prostitution really starts to be well, the numbers of women working as prostitutes were definitely going down because of that, not because of the legislations of the Victorians or some social activism of some moralists. This wasn't really the way to do it. You might ask yourself why in the 19th century. This Victorian morality is one reason. The other reason is, of course, the urbanization and industrialization, and especially the reality of city life, in which people didn't really know their neighbors too well, or you could just go to another area in the city, another district, and be completely unrecognizable, be completely anonymous. This was a tempting thing for many very poor women. Of course, if you know anything about the pay structure in the 19th century, women in the working class were paid much less than men, because men were supposed to be earning for the entire family. But what if a woman was unmarried? She would have to work much longer and harder to get the same pay as the man, so she might be tempted to earn some extra money as a prostitute from time to time. For the Victorians, they never noticed that. For the Victorians, if you were a prostitute, it meant you were a prostitute all the time. And you were a kind of broken person with warped character and some sort of sexual deviation probably. You were not like a normal woman, you were a fallen character. That is why, of course, they never really tried to do anything systematic to help these poor working class women. This leads us, of course, to Jack the Ripper again and his crimes, and there was a lot of sensational treatment of those stories in the press, mostly because they were mysterious and because the victims were so low on the social scale. They were the prostitutes of the poor, or perhaps even the poorest areas in London, and the killer was suspected to be a gentleman. So there was this another, tingle of the class difference between the victims and the murderer. So that's the situation. You may ask yourself whether there is anybody left in the gallery of Victorian perverts. Let's see in the next part.